Good morning, everybody. Hope you're well. This is quite an exciting day for us. This is the first time we've, I suppose, had a talk on certain, I think, certain issues or jewellery items. Sarah, thankfully, was introduced to us from a colleague at the Diamond Producers Association. Lisa Levinson, if you're on the call, hi, shout out. The story of the Jeweller Support Network is that we are working together with a number of other authorities in the industry and providing reports, resources, funding availability all at this time. So if you haven't yet, I encourage you to visit naj.co.uk/Jeweller Support Network. My name's Ben Massey. I look after the marketing and communications for the National Association of Jewellers. I've been on a few of these webinars today, and you know we are still very much planning to continue these in the future. Earlier this week, we passed 1,000 registrations since we did these, so we're about 3 or 4 weeks in, and we've gone past 1,000 registrations, which is superb. So thank you for all of the support on these webinars so far. We continue to look at Tuesdays and Thursdays at 11 AM to host these, and we are starting to publish some of the forthcoming webinars that we've got in the coming weeks. Tuesday, Lisa Erler is going to be hosting Creating and Communicating Luxury, and then we've also got on the Thursday, Workplace Wellbeing, Mental, Physical and Cultural. And that's from Rebecca Day, who was due to speak at our summit that was taking place in June, which was postponed to 2021. The talk today, it's great to see you guys checking in, by the way. Please let us know where you're watching from today, see which part of the country or internationally. Hello from Paris. Wow, fantastic.
We had Greece a minute ago too.
So yeah, please feel free to share where you're dialing in from, and also if you've got any questions or comments on things as well. If there are any technical issues, then my colleague David will come up as admin. He'll try to administer those as soon as possible. But yeah, so thank you, Sarah, for joining us today. I'll leave you to introduce yourself, if that's okay, and just continue with the presentation. Okay.
Thank you very much for having me, Ben. Lovely. So my name's Sarah Duncan, as you probably can see, and I am the head of the jewellery department at Chiswick Auctions. Chiswick Auctions is a West London auction house, and I set up the department there about 3 years ago now. I am furloughed, as I'm sure many of you are, so I'm really loving the opportunity to do these webinars and the talks and lectures that we're doing to keep myself sane. So bear with me here. So what I want to talk to you about today is sentimental jewelry. Now, a lot of people have gotten in touch in the lead up to this and said, that's great. What's sentimental jewelry? And that's an absolutely wonderful question. So what we're going to be talking about today is jewelry that actually has been made with an intrinsic message in mind. So all jewelry that we own has sentiment. You know, it was your mother's earrings. It was the cufflinks you bought yourself when you, you know, got that great promotion. It was, you know, your wedding band, your eternity ring that you bought on the Ponte Vecchio to celebrate your 5-year anniversary. All jewelry has sentiment, but us as the wearers bring that sentiment to the jewelry. What I'm talking about today is different. I'm talking about jewelry that was made by a designer or a jeweler with an already intrinsic message or sentiment as part of its core identity. So that's really what I'm going to be talking about. And we're going to go through a few themes. I'm going to try and structure this somewhat chronologically. Bear with me, there's a lot of overlap in some of the topics, but somewhat chronologically as we go through history and straight up into the 20th century and today. So it will be a wide-ranging topic. The first picture here, I just thought this was great. I came across this when I was prepping for this webinar. This is 1897, Birmingham. And the title of the photograph was Making Cheap Brooches. And I just thought that was brilliant. But this is what sentimental jewelry created, especially in the late Industrial Revolution, was this big production of jewelry in this country. And I also thought it was brilliant to mention how many women, it's a low quality photograph, I do apologize, but how many women are there working? And there's at least 3 that I can make out in that photograph. And so jewelry's always been particularly women-centric, but we were making as well as wearing, which I think is a great thing to keep in mind. So sentimental jewelry, so I'm going to be talking about morning jewelry, posy rings, eternity rings, a lot of different things that have a particular sentiment as part of their design. And I think what's interesting is that a lot of these have actually survived because they were actually made from what was called lesser materials. So jewelry, as we know, is always being redesigned, recreated over the centuries. And that's what makes older pieces particularly rare, is because they are the ultimate green object. You can recycle and reset and redesign them. But the lesser materials, some of these were gilt, some of these were made out of organics like coral or ivory, and they weren't as much of a motivation to reset them. So they do survive in a lot more numbers. Jewelry has a lot of social acceptability implications. And because these jewels had sentiment in them, it was much more socially acceptable in really strict societies to wear these jewels because they weren't just ostentatious. They had a message, an emotional connection that made them more socially acceptable. So even in, Roman and Tudor times, there was very strict rules about what you could and could not wear, depending upon your social class. And in Victorian times, you even see these very austere black and white photos of these very stern looking women. But they were very frequently wearing multiple jewels, and it was okay because they had sentiment to them. And I think that's a really interesting point for us to remember, is that having this emotional, clear message sort of bypasses social controls on what is and is not acceptable. It is important to wear this because it has this meaning that is clearly relayed to the wearer. So the first thing we're going to be talking about is posy rings, one of my favorite subjects. Posy rings were a very simple jewel, but could become more elaborate. The one I'm showing here in this opening slide is a very simple example. But really, they were starting in the late medieval period and continued all the way up into the mid-19th century. But the period I'm going to be focusing on now is the 17th to 19th century, roughly. So what is a posy ring? A posy ring is, in its simplest definition, a very simple band, like the one I'm showing here, with an inscription. And the inscription is actually a poésie, which is a little rhyme or a little poem in French. And it was a message that you relayed to the person you gave it to, and then they then relayed to the rest of the world, depending upon whether or not that inscription was on the inside or the outside of the band. So here are a few examples, varying degrees of elaborateness here in these examples. So the one I showed you in the opening slide, I'm pointing to the screen like you can see my pointing, sorry about this. So the one you can see in the opening example is really sweet. It says, "Forget not he who loveth thee." So a really simple romantic sentiment. Most of the time, posy rings were either romantic or religious in nature, and quite frequently they crossed over. So one of them, for instance, is a good crossover example, is "God above, increase our love." So that's one of the really typical ones that you can come across. In terms of the marketability for these, obviously the romantic ones are a lot more desirable nowadays. The religious ones, still desirable, but not as commercially aggressive in their presentation to the market. The idea of whether or not the band on the inside or outside has the engraving was part of the message that you were relaying, what the sentiment was that you were relaying. So in the sort of late medieval period, the whole idea of chivalry and romantic love brought about these hidden messages that you have. So some of them can be a little bit even, slightly raunchy, actually, by the time period. So one that I loved was, I long to have, but blush to crave. So really, really clear message there on what sort of communication, what sort of sentiment you're giving to your recipient of that ring. The other two I'm showing here, the one in the center is a little bit unusual one. This is a memento mori posy ring. And the message on the inside here was absolutely heartbreaking. It said, "My love by this presented is." And what makes that so heartbreaking is the fact that on the outside of the band was actually a skeleton. So it could have possibly been a deathbed declaration of love, which is just really, really romantic, but also heartbreaking. And then the one on the far right, again, a non-typical example, a more elaborate example, probably the most elaborate example I've seen. This was one that I had the pleasure of being one of the principal catalogers on, and when I was working at Bonhams, actually. And it is about 1660, and those are all enameled flowers on the outside. They're actually 3D, so they stand up on the band, and passing underneath them is a line of hair work. We're going to talk more about hair work in a bit, but it is just absolutely beautiful, breathtakingly beautiful. And the inscription on the inside, which is in English, so we can say it was probably made in England, despite the very Dutch look to it all, was "Difficulty sweetens enjoyment." And I just thought that is such a perfect message for the world that we're living in right now. Difficulty sweetens enjoyment. I just thought that was absolutely brilliant. So posy rings, starting in sort of the late medieval period, continuing into the 19th century, but by the mid-19th century, they were pretty much phased out. And this sort of final nail on the coffin, as it were, was the Hallmarking Act of 1855, and the classic English hallmark that we know becoming completely obligatory. And you lost the space on the inside of the band. So they really went out of popularity then, because there just wasn't enough space for these messages. Before that, jewelers would keep these posy rings in stock, and people would come in, order one up. They had a whole list of mottos they could choose from. Of course, if you were more romantic and more of a Wordsworth, you could put your own inscription in. But jewelers would just keep these in stock, and so people would have them to buy and give to their loved ones. And from this very simple band with these romantic notions, we get our modern wedding bands. So this is a very clear line, so much so that we can trace it to pretty much when Queen Victoria and Prince Albert got married in 1840, February 1840. They were the first couple to exchange bands. It was a Germanic custom, and Queen Victoria took it upon herself to give her husband, the bridegroom, a wedding band. And this was not something that was typically done in the UK before that. So this is where this whole tradition of wedding bands comes from. So one of the most sentimental jewels, again, a very clear sentiment. You're wearing it, you know what that means. That's a clear message being passed on, coming from a very simple band with a very simple message. So we're going to move on to acrostic jewels now. Now, posy rings, wedding bands, those have continued in popularity. Acrostic jewels are not something that you see very much anymore, although probably a lot of you have heard of them. So this is the whole question of spelling out a message through the use of the words of the gems. So this was a really popular trend in the 19th century. It sort of had its peak between the 1830s to the 1850s, but it continued in popularity. It was something that the Victorians really loved because of their fascination with gem lore, with these magical properties they thought gemstones had. It wasn't a new concept to them. It was a medieval concept that they completely became rather fascinated with. Victorians in general were completely immersed in the ideas of symbolism and what things represented in the communication that their artistic output relayed to the rest of the world. One of the earliest examples you see here are 3 bracelets that were commissioned by the French Empress Marie-Louise. She was Austrian, but she married Napoleon. She was Napoleon's second wife. And these are very rare. These were mentioned in Verve, actually. And you can see that they have dates, and then the gemstones actually spell out words. So the words are in French. The reason this works is, thank God, that most French words for gemstones are actually starting with the same letters as English words. So thank God that works. But they've spelled out dates and things that were important to her. So the first one, the top one, is Napoleon's birthday. It's the months and the days in his birthday. Second one's her birthday, and the bottom one is actually when they met and then married. I think they got married about 4 different times because of all these proxy rules, but it's another issue entirely. But that's her looking very fabulous in her regal robes. She only was the French empress for about 4 years. Sadly, it didn't go terribly well for Napoleon. But this started a trend which became very popular in England. This is all part of the Romantic movement, this sort of obsession with, a sort of reaction against neoclassicism, really, which is very stringent. Romanticism far more embracing of an artistic expression. So these sentimental jewels here were spelling out a message to the wearer, to the person who sees someone as well wearing it. So not just the person who's wearing it, but the wearer is communicating to the outside world that they are loved, that they are adored. So the one in the top left, the pendant, spells out the word love. What more could you want? So we've got lapis, opal, vermeil, which was an old word for garnet, and then emerald. These gems really were dependent upon the wearer having an understanding of the older gemstone words, because they kind of had to make sure they worked. I actually substituted a few just to make sure it worked for the alphabet needs. And then the one in the bottom right, adore. So that's an amethyst, not a sapphire, on the far left. So, amethyst, diamond, opal, ruby, emerald. And then regards and dearest are spelled out in the others. So really a very clear message the recipient, the wearer has, and then that they're passing on to the rest of the world as well. That was a big trend in a very romantic way. And one of the more sad trends in jewelry was mourning jewelry. So sadly, life didn't go on for as long as we always hope. And mourning jewelry was a very, very popular trend in Victorian jewelry. Now, I could talk for 3 or 4 webinars about mourning jewelry, so I'm just going to try and keep it focused and curtailed a little bit to keep you with me. But mourning jewelry, it has a very long history in English and French and a lot of continental jewels. What's interesting is that you see quite a lot of transference of gem and jewelry movement across countries, across continents, actually. The focus of this talk is obviously on Western jewelry, but it did move around a lot, which I think is really important for us to always remember. The focus of what I'm going to be talking about for mourning jewelry is on 18th and 19th century examples, as much as I can right now, just to keep it focused. The thing that people like to consider mourning jewels, but isn't really, is memento mori. So the one here on your left, the skull ring, this is 1610. And that is a memento mori ring. So memento mori, remember thou must die. This was a message that the wearer communicated to themselves. A clear sentiment again, but it's a message to yourself to remember your mortality, to remember how fragile your life is, and encourage you, the wearer, to live a virtuous life. Because you never know when the Black Death could get you, or that horse will run you down. Life was something that you were gifted and that you should be very careful of, because it is very fragile. That's a message we can all identify with. But this type of jewelry was worn to remember your own mortality. What I'm going to focus on is mourning jewelry. So that is a sentiment of your own loss, of your own admiration, of your own continued devotion to a particular individual that you are no longer with, sadly. So that's the slight difference between memento mori and mourning jewels. Mourning jewelry was very popular in the 19th century, 17th century as well, sorry, 1700s as well, but 19th century in particular, because, you know, although life was difficult, and, you know, child mortality rates were very, very high, there was also a few political situations, the Crimean War, the Indian Uprising, both in the mid to late 1850s, that required a lot of women and a lot of people to find these jewels a necessary part of life. So the two here that I'm going to be mentioning are the one on the far right, the sort of double ring, that's a ring, is a really beautiful, beautiful example. That's actually from Les Luminaires in New York, and that's French, so that's 1770 to 1790s. And the message that's being relayed here is, you can see the young girl at the bottom, and you can see the loyal hound at her feet begging for attention. I'm sure all of us with dogs know that pose very well. But a loyal hound at her feet, continuing to show his devotion, his interest in her. And then she, in her other hand, holds the myrtle crown above two lovebirds or two doves, so symbols of love. So it's her continued devotion to her lover held in each hand there, that message that she's relaying. And you can see the panel above has got initials, and on the bottom you can see that very finely woven, that's hair work on the bottom. So the whole message here is that she is remembering a lost love and showing her continued devotion. This is something she would wear to remind herself, but also to reiterate to the rest of the world that she remains devoted to her lost love. The one in the center is a pendant that I sold about a year ago, actually. And this is a much more typical example of a mourning jewel. The one on the right and the one on the left, both extremely pinnacles of their type, actually. But the one on the left, the one in the center, you'll see far more of. So this, the weeping willow, is all made of hair, as is the foreground, all made of human hair. And then you have the maiden, the young woman, mourning at the altar, the urn of her lost love. And the inscription on that one says, "In death lamented, as in life beloved." And on the back of it, it has hair work. So a really, really beautiful commitment of their devotion, and a sentiment that they're continuing to display, continuing to relay to the people in their lives, that they remain devoted to their lost love. Obviously, the two political events that I mentioned were huge, huge factors for the continued need of mourning jewelry. But once Prince Albert died in 1861, then the whole nation just became obsessed with mourning jewelry. So you see a lot more coming in the 1800s. A few earlier examples here, you can see the one on the left, I think is really interesting, actually. This is actually an American example. This was made in New York in the 1764, I believe. And it has a maker's mark for Myers. His parents weren't very creative with their names, were they? But that's his maker's mark. And this is kind of interesting because this is a conglomeration of a mourning and a memento mori. So it has iconography for both very clearly shown. So you can see in the center, there's a skull under that faceted paste. The skull is actually printed on paper, which is kind of interesting. And then the band is highly characteristic of a mourning ring. So you have the name picked out in gold lettering under a black enameled background. And you would have the name and the dates, usually, and also the age. So this gentleman was 53 when he died. And then the one on the right is very neoclassical in its form. That one was something I sold not long ago. The one on the left, I think, was sold at Christie's, but the one on the right was something I sold about a year ago. I think the same owner as the center one, actually. And it was the most beautiful opalescent glass underneath. The whole thing just shimmered in the sunlight. It was absolutely stunning. It was quite large, so you probably wouldn't have worn it as a jewel, maybe, but something you would keep in your possession. And it was absolutely gorgeous. Again, that is all hair work and tiny seed pearls. Pearls would be representing tears in this instance. I want to also mention how, as with Prince Albert's sad death, how popular mourning jewelry became. It was the thing that most people had, in so much as people also started combining multiple family members into one jewel. So you'd have ones which have, you know, husband and wife and daughter all combined into one. It was very tragic, very sad. The families were piling them in together. And like so much with jewelry, we start moving away from bespoke creations into more mass production at this time. So by the 1850s, 1860s, definitely by 1900, we're doing a lot more mass production. So these six here, these six mourning brooches, were probably mass-produced examples that you would then buy and supply your own hair work to have that personalized sentiment. And then you might also have an inscription done as well on it. So these were all recently sold at Bonham's, actually. And you can see they all have that very classic in memory of. So no personalization to them, which imply that they were made in large numbers for you to pick and to use for yourself. The one on the left is slightly earlier, and it's a slightly more premium example because it does have the personalized initials in the center there. So the classic in memory of, but with initials stating who it was. This one I think is really sad, actually, because this was you can see the very elaborate hair work around it. The bracelet, it was probably never intended to be a mourning jewel, the bracelet, because the girl sadly died at the age of 20. She died on the 13th of July. I think it was 1834, memory serves. But she died very young, who knows why. And we can see that the bracelet that was being created was probably something that she was working on, her mother was working on for quite some time. You would keep your hair. You wanted to have your own hair. There's a lot of concerns amongst contemporary diarists about having hair, you know, ordering a mourning jewel and having someone else's hair used. It was quite a concern amongst wearers and commissioners of these jewels. You always wanted to have the hair of the living. It's a bit gruesome, but the hair of the dead in a lot of contemporary examples, in diarists was too brittle, they say. So you want to make sure you would have the hair of the living. So much so that Garrods, the queen's, the royal jewelers, would keep boxes of royal hair in their archives, as it were, just in case an order came through. So they had Queen Victoria's hair on file, as it were, to use. And Queen Victoria was a huge proponent of hair work jewelry. She absolutely loved it. And she apparently exchanged hair work bracelets with the French Empress Eugenie at a sort of royal visit at one point. The Empress wept. It was so emotional that she would give her own hair. It was absolutely lovely. Those would have been professionally made, but with their own hair, actually. And that leads me to the idea of who's making these jewels. So professionals, there was celebrated royal hair work jewelers to the French and the British crown, but you could make your own. So this image on the left is actually from an American example. So this was a catalog that you could order, a sample, sort of, you know, just like you would have an embroidery sampler, you could have a hairwork sampler for patterns and designs. And this is an American example. Chap named Mark Campbell, I believe, published this one in I think it was mid 1860s, actually. And you could, you could make your own. Sorry, 1875, beg your pardon. And this bracelet here on the right, which is in no way a mourning jewel. This is just a lovely example, but this is in the British Museum, and this was made from a pattern in his book. So those are all human hair made into these these patterns. It was interesting when I was preparing for this lecture, I put a little poll on my Instagram and I said, who likes hair work jewelry? Because people can be very polarized on it. And surprisingly, quite a lot of people said yes. The majority said yes. So I was quite touched by that. So just to go on and sort of reiterate how important the wearing of these memorial sentiments were to the Victorians, they actually extended even to their animals. This is such a popular trend that people had memorial jewels made up for their lost pets. Obviously, this would have been at the very top echelons of society, but dog memorial jewels do pop up. I mean, they're very rare, don't get me wrong, but they do pop up. The one on the left here is for a Pomeranian named Muff. And Muff sadly died in India, actually, in 1862. And I think upon returning to England, the family chose to have Muff immortalized in this jewel, and it was actually a bit of Muff's hair on the back. The one on the right is incredibly rare, and that was actually a horse. That was believed to have belonged to the Wellington family, but that sort of Prince of Wales feather that in the center there, that's horsehair. And the inscription on it is quite bizarre, but it was something about heart of oak, so showing loyalty, showing fidelity, sorry. And it said for 22 years of loyal service before it was shot. So yeah, another really interesting example of how important showing your emotion, showing your commitment and your perpetual love for your lost loved ones was in mourning jewelry. So moving past mourning jewelry, moving past that subject, but running in conjunction with mourning jewelry was snakes and jewelry. So snakes are a really interesting topic. I'm terrified of snakes personally. And I used to think this was all about sort of Judeo-Christian symbolism for how we perceive these things. And that's true. In Judeo-Christian iconography, a snake is a very negative animal, but in a lot of Eastern mythology, it's a very positive animal, but also in classical mythology. So in Greco-Roman iconography, a snake is a guardian, and that is the application of its image that became very popular in the Victorian period. Even earlier, in Egyptian iconography, you would see snakes quite a lot. And the Egyptians were a very popular theme in a lot of Victorian jewelry. And this Ouroboros symbol of a snake consuming its own tail, creating a line of eternity, a never-ending line of eternity, was something which the Victorians really identified with. This unbreakable ring, this unbroken connection from start to finish was what the Victorians were trying to embody by using this snake motif. The story goes that Prince Albert had Queen Victoria's engagement ring designed as a snake. That image on the top right is a artist's interpretation of what it could have looked like. I don't think it's terribly accurate because it's not an Ouroboros. It's crossing over. So I don't think it's terribly accurate, but she did apparently receive a snake engagement ring from Prince Albert and wore it every day of her life and is buried in it. So we don't know what it looks like for sure, but that's what it was. And this caused a sensation. Whatever the royals did, everyone else followed. But even before this, snakes were already starting to enter into jewelry of the period, particularly into bracelets. Apparently Queen Victoria wore a snake bracelet on her first ever council meeting in 1837 when she first became empress. But this became quite a trend in Victorian jewelry. So the example on the left there, showing that it wasn't just unique, again, not just unique to England or to the UK. That's a Swiss example. The enamel work's so characteristic. That's one by, that's held by S.J. Phillips. That's where that image has come from. But it absolutely exquisite example of the Urubis symbol, the never-ending eternity, that unbroken line of commitment with the snake consuming its own tail. And the Victorians really appreciated these snake jewels because of the amount of technical know-how that you had to make one of these jewels. The workmanship is astronomical on them. All of these little links, working so perfectly to connect, to make this sinuous line. It's just absolutely beautiful. And you can see that it was a trend throughout the 1900s, particularly from the late 1830s onwards. This portrait of a lady here on the right is, we don't know who she is exactly, I'm afraid, but she is wearing a snake bracelet. You can see there on her wrist, a snake bracelet right in the center. This is a great image for jewelry. There's so much characteristic Victorian jewelry happening in this. The big locket in the center was one of the most popular trends. But the snake right there, and you can start to see how the image of the snake leaves behind the Oribus and starts becoming more of a crossover, which was very popular as well. So here's a few more examples. The turquoise set one there, highly characteristic. We actually have a really, really similar one coming up in a next sale, but that one was from Sotheby's there. And again, the Oribus, the snake consuming its tail. And then the enameled examples on the left are really characteristic as well. What's kind of interesting is that you can actually start dating these based on the head, and you can start to see when the Eastern influences become more and more prevalent when Japan opens up and the sort of whole Western society becomes obsessed with the Eastern influences. And then the one on the bottom right, I just thought I'd throw in because I think that's hilarious. That's by Tiffany, actually. That's 1890s. That's a Tiffany ring, a Tiffany, New York, and with colored diamonds in the head, and it's a three-headed snake. And I just thought that was brilliant. And it shows how the original sentiment of the Oribus, of the unending circle, has slowly become reinterpreted, and we're now getting just really fun, crazy examples. So that brings us very directly onto what I think, and a lot of other people think, is the direct reinterpretation of these never-ending circles, which is the eternity ring. So probably something that all of you are very familiar with, having owned one or sold one, but the eternity ring came into prevalence just around the time that the snakes stopped being very prevalent. So it's a pretty clear line of that eternal devotion into a very modern concept of a jewel. So we're moving very much into the 20th century now. So I love this, diamond, adamas, so unconquerable or eternal. And then we have the eternity ring from this very clearly. So one jeweler gets a lot of credit for popularizing eternity rings, and that's De Beers. And that might be very true, but they were already a pretty well-established trend before De Beers gets the credit from the big marketing campaign that they did in the 1960s for eternity rings. So the 4 rings here on the right are from the 1930s. That's an image from Sotheby's. But really, the eternity ring as a jewel in its own right comes into being in about the 1920s. And you can see here, I thought this was a great one. I just wanted to sort of reiterate that it was very much so a trend before the 1960s. You can see this Tiffany Blue Book from, I think this is from 1949. And you can see there in the bottom, very clear, an eternity ring. So they were already a very popular trend. A lot of times they were worn stacked, particularly in the 20s and 30s, which is where you see these multiple gemstone ones. And really by the 1950s, these have become very much so a pinnacle of a desirable woman's jewelry box. So 2 very famous women associated with eternity rings were Grace Kelly on our left, wearing, gazing very, very admirously at her eternity ring, which was her first engagement ring from Cartier. Prince Rainier, Monaco, proposed with a ruby and diamond eternity ring that he bought from Cartier. And I'm sure Grace Kelly thought it was absolutely charming and really lovely, but she promptly took him back to Cartier and got a 10.5-carat diamond, which she wore very famously for the rest of her life. She refused to take it off, even for film screenings. But her first engagement ring was an eternity ring. And Marilyn Monroe, just a few years before, 1954, her second wedding to Joe DiMaggio, she had an eternity ring as her wedding ring, and that's her having her makeup done, wearing her eternity ring, her wedding band. That one sold in 1999 at Christie's, and it did rather well, actually, as you can imagine. It was missing a diamond, but it still did very, very well. It was in for a high estimate of $50,000, and it sold for I think $770,000. So quite a popular one there. But De Beers does get the credit, and rightly so, for the mass campaign to promote eternity rings. So the story goes that they had a stockpile of small diamonds in the 1960s, and to offload them, they created this campaign. So this idea that your eternal bond to your loved one shouldn't just end with an engagement ring and a wedding band. You should be continuing to show your eternal devotion to, or the sentiment of your eternal love continues to be reinforced through this eternity band. So these are two adverts from I think the early 70s and the 80s there. And it's true, even today, this clear sentiment, this never-ending devotion, which an eternity ring relays to the wearer, is here through this band. So, and the ones on the far right are by Jarre, 2015. Those are at Symbolic and Chase, and purple sapphires and diamonds. So if Jarre can still make eternity bands, then they must still be quite clearly a very desirable trend. I know we're running very late, so I'm just going to have one more topic very quickly, because I think it's important that we just talk about one more very clear sentiment in jewelry, and that is the love bangle. Bet you didn't see that one coming. So the love bangle was designed in 1969, and the message, it really shouldn't be called a love bangle. It should be called a commitment bangle. So it was designed by a chap called Aldo Cipulo. That's him, hello. Very dapper chap, Italian-American, and despite being a very popular man, he sadly got dumped one night and, very heartbroken, stumbled into his studio at 3 o'clock in the morning and designed a piece of jewelry that you couldn't just take off. You can't just slide it off your finger like a wedding band. You have to wear this to show your commitment. So he designed this Spartanly simplistic jewel, and it created a sensation. It was absolutely huge. The idea initially when it was released was you had to wear them in pairs. You couldn't just buy one for yourself. You had to buy one for your lover. And they have to, if anyone's ever worn a love bangle, they have to be screwed onto your wrist. They're very tricky to put on. So you can't just take these things off. And Aldo Cipulo's message was that you should have a symbol of commitment. And indeed, at the time, wearing a love bangle was akin to basically being engaged. And in order to promote this message of commitment and that these are the ultimate lover's accessories, Cartier gave them out to 25 high-profile couples. So the Duke and Duchess of Windsor got a pair, Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton got a pair, Ali McGraw and Steve McQueen had one, and these celebrities wore these for years and years, continuing this message of commitment, of eternal love, which these pieces relay. So I thought that was a good way to end the idea of sentiment through jewelry. This was a huge topic. Thank you for bearing with me. I'm sorry, I know we're a bit longer than you probably would have liked that, Ben. But there's a lot of topics I didn't have a chance to get into, like Trinity rings, the language of flowers, et cetera, et cetera. But if you want to talk about any of these things, I'm very happy to take questions from whoever wants to talk about them. But I think it's really important, this idea of sentiment being an important message that we as the wearer can relay to our audience, our people in our lives. And the jewelers really can start being the ones to spread this necessary jewel that you have to show a particular sentiment. Welcome back, Ben.
That was, it's always fulfilling to see somebody else that's terrified of snakes. I know my children terrorise me with snakes, with pretend snakes.
Absolutely.
Wow, that was.
But they look cute as jeweled.
Yeah, that was so interesting. So let's see what questions we've got coming in for the guys on the call following. Yeah, please start posting some of the questions in there. I'm going to start with one. So I was looking at the polls that we've got. The question about, do you regularly sell or specialize in antique or vintage jewelry? I wanted to ask a question about why should jewelers that don't currently regularly sell or specialize in this area, why should they start doing that?
Well, personally, I think it's a great example of the ultimate in an eco-friendly product. So a secondhand jewel is entirely carbon footprint free, as it were. I often joke that when clients bring jewels in for valuation with me, I joke that their carbon footprint was the bus trip they took, or the tube trip they took. That's all there is. So secondhand jewels can offer jewelers a real advantage to stock a product that puts them aside from the competition. A lot of secondhand jewels are highly unique. You're not going to get the same product showing up in other jewelers' repertoires, but they might. But it is a highly unique product that can give them the advantage, and also the workmanship and the quality of gemstones that you can get in secondhand jewelry versus that of some of the more mass-produced examples, depending on obviously what the jeweler stocks, is amazing, and it just adds that little extra feather in their cap to their stock. And again, I think the demand for recycled gemstones, for fair trade gold, for all of these things is becoming such an important part of a jeweler's requests now, that antique vintage jewelry just ticks all those boxes intrinsically.
Yeah, I think from the sort of consumer research side of things as well, what we learned at the Retailers Congress last year is that Mintel, who developed a lot of research into consumer buying behaviours, that they looked at bespoke, pre-loved, but this is even further. The stories behind some of the items it's one that the backstories, even some of the things you touched on today, certainly the NAJ members that are stocking and supplying both antique and vintage, there's that USP in there that stands them around from anybody else in that certain area.
Absolutely. And a lot of the jewels I showed really spanned quite a wide price point. So some of these can be quite affordable, maybe mid to high hundreds in the sort of auction market, and then some of the examples I show you were close to $1 million, Marilyn Monroe's example, but they can be a very wide price point for people to start maybe slowly adding to their stock to see how the response is. You don't have to make huge investments to start with antique jewels. You can start with something that could just be a couple of £100.
Yeah. So, and also how, responding to another poll question there, how some jewelers may have asked for a jewel to be a bespoke item to produced in a certain style that they've seen somewhere, they've been inspired around a type of item. I love the idea of the love bangle, and so I hear your point about the commitment, and I think that where as a sector, we're able to sort of uncover some of these areas and to work together to uncover some of the inspiration that allows the consumer to be informed, to sort of let their mind, particularly in the bespoke world, sort of run a little bit freer.
Absolutely.
So we've got.
It was actually really interesting. The jewelers in the 19th century in particular were never shy of a marketing opportunity. And this whole symbolism of jewelry, these symbolic messages, these sentiments that were being relayed became so tailored and so formalized that there's actually stories in literature about people going into shops and trying to buy a jewel, and the woman coming out and saying, or the shopkeeper coming out and saying, yes, but would you like a love jewel or a nuptial jewel? And they were completely different things. And I thought that was fascinating. The love jewel, the jeweler in this instance pointed to, was earrings and a necklace, but a nuptial jewel was a bracelet or a ring. And you can read into that what you might on where the gentleman might want to be looking for the love jewel. But these were highly specified items that jewelers took the opportunity to market to their clients. So, oh yes, you might have a love jewel, but do you have a nuptial jewel? So continued opportunities to sell and to reinforce these messages.
And so you talked about sort of men, but in a slightly different way, men's jewelry. Some of the types of jewelry that you touched on, was it just women that wore them, or were there certain things that men wore as well?
No, a lot of this jewels could have been worn by men, actually. Particularly the morning jewelry was hugely popular. The posy rings were hugely popular with men. There's a great quote in Dickens, I think, in Great Expectations, where Pip sees one of these characters and he's wearing, a large number of mourning rings, and he thinks, oh, he's lost so many people in his life. But no, this guy was just picking up very cheap because they the people no longer needed this sentiment they had passed on. So they became worthless once they didn't have that personal sentiment. So this guy was just wearing them all the time. But yeah, men wore quite a lot of these jewels as well. Hairwork bracelets were worn by men. A lot of the morning jewels. The love bangle was actually designed as a guy's jewel. It's, don't tell any of the Instagram generation out there that they were wearing 6 or 7 of them, but they were actually designed to be worn by men.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that question. So we've got a question just slightly earlier from Leslie. Is one of the pieces in the photos, the Regards ring, was 12 carats.
Yeah.
Do you know what date that was that carat was used?
Yeah, let me go back here, actually. So this was the Regard ring, I believe. Hold on. That one was actually one, I think, at Bentley and Skinner. And I think that one dates to 1860s. This one. So the top right there. Oh, I lost it. Sorry. But yeah, that dates to the 1860s. I think 1864, if memory serves. But yes, so jewelers were allowed under UK law to experiment with a lot more carat weights of gold. So you see 12, although very rare. 15 you see a lot of, which became 14. But yes, you could use those lower carats of gold, but they became more standardized into the 20th century. And by I think someone's very kindly put up the dates for us, actually. 1932 is when 12 karat gold went out. Yes. And then 15 karat gold went out, I think, shortly thereafter.
Yeah, thanks for that, Craig, for feeding it. If there's any other questions of you guys watching today, please feel free to post them in. And just as I said that, Eric, would you consider the modern trilogy ring is a progression in sentimentality from the eternity ring?
The trilogy ring, or the Trinity ring, or the Russian wedding bands, as they're known, have a few. I don't have any images of them. Sorry. Have a few associations. the classic one being the religious sentiment, so the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And then a lot of people nowadays consider them to be more of the, our past, our present, and our future symbolism that they use in them. And I think that's how they're marketed by a lot of the big firms. But yes, it's the same perpetual band, that same never-ending hoop, the Oribus, that presents a a sort of a message of unending devotion. So yeah, you could extrapolate that from it, definitely.
Are there jumping into the question about sort of linking things to celebrities? We ran some consumer research, which is available to NAJ members on the website, and we were quite interested because what we were trying to achieve here is we're trying to stimulate consumer demand. So we put a stunt question into our research. It was a part of a syndicate. So there was ourselves, the guys at CMJ, and also Goldsmiths Company. We all funded the research together. And we thought, right, let's put a question in about influencers on jewellery. And we thought, right, well, who's the celebrity? It's a ready-made press release. We can get that all out. Leading into Christmas, so-and-so is the most influential celebrity within jewellery. But the fact was, we found out that actually it wasn't one particular person, and the people that were who bought jewellery, that it wasn't celebrities that were the most influential person. It was actually their local jeweller. Which was it's fascinating, and it's also the research that said that only half the people, half of the consumers really knew where their local jeweller was. So I think there's some work for us to do there as a community to make sure that's awareness is firmly built. But my question is this: other than celebrities, with sentimental jewellery, were there any other particular sources of inspiration?
The royals. The royals, whatever Queen Victoria did, whatever Prince Albert did, and their children did, the whole world followed. Despite Queen Victoria's isolation after her husband's death, the country still very adamantly followed her where she led. They used her as a huge source of inspiration. So this whole national mourning that overcame the entire British public for most of the 19th century was all led by her. And like I said, yes, death was a very sad reality of life, but she was the trendsetter. And Prince Albert, I have to say, he was a very stylish guy. He was definitely coming up with some beautiful, innovative designs. So people were happy to follow them because they were so important. Even what I thought was really interesting was that they followed these trends even despite the fact that they probably didn't necessarily always communicate with them connect with them. And one example of that is hairwork jewelry, which I mentioned, is completely out of fashion when mourning jewelry stops. When Queen Victoria is finally convinced to leave her deepest mourning and sort of slightly reemerges onto the public sale, hairwork jewelry goes completely out of fashion. No one wants it anymore. So people were committed to doing this because it was considered by these trendsetters the right thing to do. But the second this decree was lifted, done with that, we're moving on.
I think so. I think certainly from the comments, there's more to be done here, Sarah, because we've unfortunately run out of time, and I think that certainly the feedback's been extremely positive. Yes, and Meghan Markle's ring, and I can notice Craig there that Prince William could have helped matters some perhaps. I think that there's certainly some also with the comments coming in, if there's certain areas that that the people who are watching today are certainly interested in, or maybe some things for us to pick up and look at, or also if you're if you're a specialist yourself and you want to talk to the rest of the industry, the community, please feel free to send us your details into marketing@naj.co.uk. We'd love to be able to host more conversations with this. I mean, the talk today has been absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure that given that we had more than 100 registrations for this, which I think just shows that perhaps there's at this time under lockdown, that the opportunity to talk about and celebrate some of the areas of jewellery, particularly looking back, as not just looking forward. Then I think that the more people we can engage with this, the better. We will be posting this as a replay on the NAJ website. All of the replays are available on /Jeweller Support Network. So if you head onto that page, you'll be able to see all the ones that we've done to date. There are a mix of Meet the Creatives, some business support webinars as well. But perhaps there's more that we could do here. And also, for people that have found this particularly useful, I have to encourage you to follow Sarah's Instagram account, which certainly comes through the passion within this subject. But yeah, so on behalf of NAJ and for the people, and you can see the comments coming in there, Sarah, thank you so much for your time today and preparing this. It's certainly a lot of preparation that's gone into it.
I would too, Natasha. I'd love a posy ring. Oh, Jenny, hello. Yeah, this is great. I could sit here watch these comments all day, but thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for everyone's questions and feedback. It's been wonderful. Okay,
I'm going to shamelessly plug some of next week's webinars, just while some further sort of comments are going in there. So on Tuesday, I'll just share the page with you. On Tuesday, we've got Lisa Erler talking about creating the image of luxury. I think that's certainly going to be quite useful, because there are further ones coming on sort of brand. We've spoken about e-commerce before. We've spoken about social media, but the image or the creation of luxury is certainly something to be mindful of. David's posted for me already. Thank you. And then we've got on Thursday next week, again, just to remind you of the Wellbeing webinar. So Rebecca Day from Rebecca Day Consulting is going to talk to us about how, particularly as an employer, people can understand and support colleagues in sometimes challenging environments. Obviously, as an association, we do hope you are in good health at the moment, and if our coffee mornings, the Mondays and Wednesdays sort of web conferences, they continue. They are popular. They've been increasingly popular, and they're just a forum. There's no structure. You can just roll in, talk about some of the things, share some of your experiences at the moment, and they are quite intimate. So we generally have 10 to 15 people on calls. So all areas of the industry as well can just share at this time and keep updated and things. And again, more details on that. What's on there? It's the photo with the person holding the coffee in front of the computer screen. But just again to say thank you to Sarah, not just for a webinar today, but for the preparation that she's put into this. Clearly, it's taken some time, and so I don't think this will be the last that we see of Sarah. Let's hope that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah. See, I'm gonna put the webcam off and the microphone off now. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, thank you. Take care.